So what I'm going to be talking about today is Yasmin's PhD work. So if you ask me any difficult questions, I'm going to deflect the answer to her, and she's just not far away at Berkeley doing a postdoc there. So what I want to talk about is utilizing storytelling techniques to enrich archival collections. All right, so this is really work with Archive-It. And Archive-It, as most of you are aware, is a subscription service that allows its members to build themed collections. So here's the home page, and we have the stats. They're probably always out of date. Lots of collections, thousands of collections, many institutions, and literally billions of archived pages are what we call mementos. We go to a particular collection. This is the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, and we see some metadata, some of this coming from the creator of the collection as well. Up at the top, we have a description. Here in the middle, we have some of the seed URIs that the creator of the collection decided was important and put them in the collection. And then also from the creator of the collection, we have some topics and other descriptive metadata that describes what we can expect to find in the collection. But one of the issues with this, as the number of collections proliferate, we have this weird scenario where the larger the collection is, the harder it is to explore and find out what's in the collection. And as different collections pop up, it's hard to differentiate one collection from another one. So Yasmin is from Egypt. The Egyptian Revolution happened while she was in Norfolk, Virginia. So almost all of the examples are going to be themed around that, and her creating collections and exploring web archives for her son, who was too young to really understand what was happening at the time. So there are at least three collections on Archive-It that have something to do with the Arab Spring or the Egyptian Revolution. And here are screenshots from them. So how do you explore what's in which collection? How can you differentiate between these collections? Even worse, in a manner of speaking, this is one of 7 human rights collections. I think there might actually be more now, and it becomes really difficult to understand what's in which collection. So this one is coming out of Columbia. So we still have the descriptive metadata, we still have the topical information, but we scroll down and we have even descriptive metadata about the seed URIs, and then we decide one of the seed URIs is interesting, and then we get essentially just a listing of how many times it's been crawled. Now, if you're already familiar with that collection, this maybe is all you need. But if you didn't create this collection, then you don't know, right? This is like the stuff that's in your attic or your basement. I mean, you put it there, but over time, you sort of lose track of what exactly is there. Sort of the ski boots that get thrown away, right? So we tried earlier attempts, some standard visualization techniques to get a better understanding to differentiate one collection from another. So we have tree maps and timelines and lots of pretty pictures that look great on the graphs. They make for great demos, but they really don't help you understand the difference between one collection. And the problem was, it was focused on trying to visualize everything. And this works with small collections, but once you have thousands of seed URIs and potentially thousands of mementos of each one of those seed URIs, you have to let go of this idea that you're going to try to visualize everything. What we really need to do is sample and come up with just a small sprinkling of what's important from the collection and use that as a summarization. So one of the ideas that we became fascinated with was the idea of storytelling. Now, that sounds cool, and it means a lot of different things. So we're here in the library, we probably have some humanities people. Storytelling for you means this, and that's great. We have characters, and they go on a journey, and can encounter conflict, and there's resolution, and we learn something in the end. That's great. That's not what we're talking about. Storytelling in social media is basically arranging pages in time, right? And so we see this with Facebook has the look back, the year in review, and there are Twitter stories, and there are other applications like anyone use 1 second every day, where it has this idea that you sample small bits of your large personal collection to try and create a summary of what's in there. So that's what we're based on. We're going to mostly talk about Storify because it has a really nice interface, but realize that the storytelling idea is represented across a lot of social media tools. So we're going to look at Storify, but if Storify goes out of business, or God forbid Apple buys Storify and kills it like they did with Topsy, then we could probably shift to another interface. So great, we have storytelling, we have these archival collections, what can we do about it, right? Why don't we just use Storify? Well, there are some limitations. So Yasmin went and found this story in Storify about the Egyptian revolution, and of course you know what's coming, right? Click on the first thing and it's 404. So Storify and all of these things are really nice, but they're kind of just fancy ways to arrange bookmarks, and there's no actual preservation behind it, because of course nobody thinks about preservation on that. So what we really want to do is take the collections that we have in places like Archivit and then combine them with a storytelling interface. And the idea is, I'm not going to try and tell you that Storify is the best available interface, but it's an interface that people already know how to use. And one of the lessons that I've learned in computer science is at some point you have to give up trying to convince people about the right way to do it and just let them use whatever tool and you adapt to the tool that they use. So for example, email is the stupidest way to move files around, right? But we do it all the time. I'll send you the slides over email. I'm like, that's a terrible, terrible thing. But eventually, okay, I'll send them to you over email, right? I'll stop trying to convince you about, now this gets better with Dropbox and other things, right? But you know what I'm talking about. So what we're trying to do is come up with these archive and rich stories and have an exploratory interface in a social media storytelling environment that users are already familiar with. So basically it works, if you consider the collections that are in Archivit, if you consider those as samples of a much larger web, right? So somebody picks out the seed URIs, conducts the crawl, and decides this is what I want to build a collection on. Really, the stories that we're going to generate are essentially doing the same thing, but are sampling from the collections. So there's a continuum of going from large to small as we go from left to right. So these were some stories that Yasmin handcrafted about the Egyptian revolution, sampling from the collections in Archivit, and we'll come back to these. So basically we have different kinds of stories that we explored, and the URLs, and I'll post the slides later so you can gain access to all of this. But these were the handcrafted stories that she created. And what I'm appealing to is, intuitively, this is a better interface for exploring the collection than the Archivit interface. Now, this is not everything that's in the collection, but this will allow you to differentiate one collection from another. So generating this by hand is difficult. Yasmin was motivated to do it for the Archivit collection, but what about the 3,000 other collections that are there? How do we do this automatically? So first, we want to discuss that collections really have two dimensions. So we have time, and this is real-world clock time, right? And then we have different URIs. So these would be the seed URIs, and we have some kind of sampling through time. Now, sometimes the page stays basically the same, sometimes the pages change. So we have a lot of variety in here, but we basically have two dimensions. And if we take the cross product between these two dimensions, at a high, rough level, we have basically four kinds of stories that we can tell. The first one is, it exists, but it's not really a focus. Basically, you could have the same page at the same time, but vary based on things like mobile versus desktop or GeoIP or something like that. So this exists, but this is not the kind of story we're going to create in the collection. Another kind of story we can do is have a fixed page in sliding time. So you could pick BBC or CNN and then just have the samples track how the story is being reported. And this gives you an idea, especially for something like the Egyptian Revolution, of what's happening through time. Then we can have a sliding page fixed time. So the idea is we pick some time that's interesting, January, I forgot, 19 of 2011, Mubarak steps down, and then we can talk about how that news story is reported at different venues. So, right, we have the BBC page, we have the CNN page, we have all these things. And we can get different perspectives of how things are being reported. And then there's sort of probably what you thought of as the most standard way, the sliding page and sliding time. Basically, we're sampling from different seed URIs at different times and basically using this to summarize. So we have a progression of the story and we also have multiples points of view here. Okay, so we're storytelling and we need a name for a framework. Obviously, we call this the dark and stormy archive framework. So I'm glad you laughed. I had to explain it to Yasmin. She didn't grow up with Snoopy, so. All right, and so basically first thing we're going to do at the top is really try to understand what's in social media collections, try to understand what is in archival collections, and then we're going to have review a set of methods to go from thousands, if not millions of pages, trying to get down to just a handful of pages that we can push into Storify. All right, so the first thing, figuring out a baseline of what people put in Storify. What does social media look like? So there are a bunch of questions that we can ask. What's the length of the story? So here we have a story that someone created about the Boston Marathon bombing. And if you scroll down, you find this has 31 things in it, 31 resources. And then we can try and figure out what kinds of resources. So you can add text, you can post videos, and have tweets and web pages and so forth. So trying to get a feel for what kinds of multimedia resources people want to include. And then we can look at domain distribution. And it won't probably be a surprise to find out that Twitter is sort of the dominant domain that people are using in Storify, because people will go on these tweet storms and have 37 tweets about a topic, and then somebody will arrange them into a story so they're all clustered and grouped together. All right, we downloaded, using the Storify API, we downloaded a whole bunch of their stories, ran some analysis, and this is the top 25 domains. Basically, Twitter is dominant with 82% of the domains. And then it falls off pretty rapidly, but it's still basically all social media, your Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Flickr, some other stuff, Blogspot, WordPress, a variety of blogging and social media platforms. And then it's a long tail of basically everything else. All right, so then we wanted to understand what constitutes a popular story. And we define popular stories as having in the top 25% of the views normalized by the time available that it was on the web. And so this is a story about the shooting in, it was in Virginia, Southwest Virginia, Roanoke or something like that. It was almost 20,000 views, and this story has 64 views. How do we tell these apart? And we analyzed a bunch of characteristics of the story. Basically, the punchline is we could tell the difference. The popular stories had a median of more resources. They typically would have 28 resources instead of 21 resources. And the editing time that people spent putting those stories together was significantly longer. And then we also looked, and this is related, that the link rot of the elements that were in the story was significantly less, 10 versus 15%, for popular versus unpopular stories. So basically, the popular stories reflect somebody performing a curatorial activity, adding more stuff, continuing to edit it, perhaps replacing broken links with non-broken links, or perhaps choosing better links to begin with. All right, so one of the takeaways here that we operationalize in the future is this gives us a target. If we're going to automatically create stories, they should start to look like human stories. And 28 was the median number for popular stories. So this gives us a target. If we're going to create a story automatically, let's shoot for 28. You know, too few elements in the story and you don't get a good summarization, and too many resources in the story, then you get a too long didn't read, right? So there's a sweet spot for the number of things that are in there. Then we also did a baseline of the archival collections. And again, here's the collection. This is Egyptian Revolution. And for example, this has 435 seed URIs. And then we looked at the mean and median of the mementos of the seed URIs. And for example, this one's got 16 resources. And then we looked at most frequently used domains. And in this collection, the Boston Marathon, we have ABC News and Blogspot, and these were top seed URIs in this collection. skipping a bunch of data. The takeaway message here is the Archive-It top 25 hosts really look nothing like the Storify top 25 hosts. So the number one slot here is the publications of the Government of Canada. Now there are Archive-It members, obviously they're archiving their own material. So that's 40% of the content that we found in Archive-It. Now it really only spans 4 collections, so obviously government publications are not super popular outside of Canada, as you might imagine. But we skip down, and Twitter is number 10. So we're not really archiving a bunch of tweets or things that are, Twitter does not show up in the Archive-It collection. So it's basically 1% of the total collection, although it does spread out over 460 collections. So there are a lot of collections that have the random tweet thrown in there, but it's not this dominant force that we find in Storify. So the takeaway message here is what we archive and Archive-It. Now remember, in Archive-It, we essentially have professional librarians, people who are archivists, people who have an idea about we should be collecting these resources for posterity. What we archive and what we share on social media are completely different, right? So seeds and shares are not the same thing. And there's been a bunch of publications that kind of find this same result over and over again. But what we're archiving and what we're viewing on social media are different. All right, so to create these collections, one of the things we were focused on was detecting off-topic pages, because this is something that can happen. Archive-It gives you really nice tools for performing the crawl and understanding what happens in the crawl. But basically the data that you get back is about HTTP events, right? You had this many hosts and this many 200s or 404s and this many MIME types and so forth. It doesn't give you an idea about the content. So Yasmin went through one of the collections, and this was a candidate for one of the first Egyptian election. This was his homepage, and this was a seed URI in the collection. And then shortly after this, it had a database error, and these were all 200s, right? So it's not detectable as 404s. And then they ran out of money, and then apparently in Arabic this says we ran out of money. I trust that she's telling me the truth on this. Then it came back online, so you can't just say, okay, you've gone off topic, you're off topic forever. That oscillates back and forth on time. Then they're hacked, and the English says they're hacked, and there's some Arabic, and then they lost the domain and it's for sale. So all this shows up in the collection. Now we're not talking about removing this from the collection, but if we're going to create a story that summarizes what's in the content, at some point these are not good candidates to show up in this story, right? We really want to detect and focus on these as representative of what the collection holds. So we can automatically, she did this by hand, we can automatically detect off-topic pages. So one way is to use a suite of textual methods. So here's one version of the page, and then it's changed, and then you can use cosine similarity, you can use Jacquard or TF, term frequency intersection. It doesn't really matter about the details, but basically, intuitively, these look the same, and the scores sort of reflect it, and you can sort of empirically determine where the thresholds are. When you compare this to that, obviously the number of terms in this case falls to 0. So we can use textual-based methods to figure out, are the subsequent changes, are they still somehow similar to the original page? All right, but sometimes the page is still on topic, but straight lexical comparison of terms won't find that for you. So some of the nouns from this page, Mubarak, Tahrir, Square, Violence, Army, and then Egypt, protests, Morsi, Cairo, president. This is clearly about the same stuff, even though the words don't overlap. Well, then there's a technique where you submit these as a query to Google, you get the snippets, and this is like a cheap and easy way to do term expansion. And then you're really counting on these terms appearing in the snippets here, and then you apply the textual results, and if they overlap, then you decide it's still more or less on topic. It turns out there's actually simpler ways to do this. We can look at the change in the size, either in the number of terms or the number of bytes that come back. So here's one version of the page. Here's another version of the page. Visually it looks very different, but it's roughly the same size. Legitimate pages have a target page size. In this case, when it says there's a database error, we notice it's significantly smaller. The page has greatly shrunk in terms of the number of terms or the bytes that are sent back for just this page, and then that's a clue that something's gone wrong. So, and this really means Yasmin, she worked really hard on this, created a gold standard data set for 3 collections, Occupy, Egypt Revolution, and the Columbia Human Rights Collection, and went through and manually labeled off-topic mementos. So, seed your eyes, total mementos, 458 off-topic, here 384 off-topic, and here 94 off-topic. So basically, she went through and manually labeled these. And then we combined individual methods and combinations of methods and basically came up with the best approach, figuring out on the gold standard data set how we could automatically tune and detect off-topic pages. Then we ran it on 18 collections and tried to discover off-topic mementos in those collections. We got pretty good results. We can't tell the ones that we missed, but we can examine the ones that were flagged as off-topic, and then we went and manually determined if they were truly off-topic. Now, some of the collections have no off-topic pages that we could detect, so that's great. Some of them had small numbers at the top, and then, here's Southern California Wildfire Web Archive, and we did really badly on this one, so we flagged 300 and some, but only 200 and some were actually off-topic. So mostly things are on topic in the collection, but it's not uniform across. All right. So if we remember, we're trying to pick 28. Now, if we exclude the off-topic pages, that gets us a lot of the way there. We thought we would find distributions like this, where we have time and seed your eyes, and we have a highly regular crawl schedule. Turns out that's not the case. We have wildly irregular crawl schedules. This gets tricky to try and pick 28 in this dimension and that dimension. And we're going to skip a lot of the details of the clustering, but basically we figured out a way to try and get to 28. To try and pick candidate pages, we want to pay attention to the quality of the page. And there's lots of dimensions of quality that we consider. One is looking at the amount of resources that were missed when it's crawled. But it's weighted towards sometimes you miss important resources and sometimes you don't. And Justin Brunel, we leveraged his PhD work where it's not just straight percentage of I got 9 out of 10, so it's 90%. If that one was the main video in the middle of the page, then that was important and your damage is greater than 10%. So basically, we want to prefer this page over that page because this one is visually less damaged, and we can figure this out dynamically. And they kind of say the same thing, but given the choice, prefer this one. Then since we're headed towards Storify, we actually prefer pages that generate more attractive snippets. So if you look at the top, you'll see that this snippet in Storify automatically gets the image. It's prettier than this, and that actually is going to matter in this interface. Even though they kind of say the same thing, we want to choose the page on the right. And basically, this can be operationalized by if you're choosing deep links into the collection, you're actually more likely to get more attractive, more meaningful snippets because the metadata is specifically about the page, and the snippets that come from high-level pages, even though the story might dominate about whatever, the metadata is just BBC is a great news source or something like that, and it doesn't help distinguish one page for another. As a footnote, turns out social media snippets social media pages don't often generate good snippets. So we don't have that many in our archival collection anyway, so it doesn't matter. All right, so we go through, we pick 28, we push them into Storify, and here are the handcrafted stories that we saw earlier. And if we zoom in, it's kind of hard to tell, but the fav icons, they all say they come from Archivit, even though they're originally crawled from different locations. They don't always have nice images, and the titles aren't so nice. So basically, you don't get this from the Storify user interface, but they have an API where you can overwrite the fav icon, you can add the date to the title, you can modify the metadata, and essentially get more attractive stories. So here, the fav icons, and it's saying this comes from National Post, BBC, New York Times, etc. And essentially, we all have the images, we have the dates in the title. We've created a more attractive interface that you don't get from just copying and pasting. All right, how do we evaluate? How do we know if our stories are good? So evaluation is tricky. There's no Voight-Kampff test. I'm in Los Angeles, I have to mention Blade Runner, right? So basically the idea is we're going to use Mechanical Turk, and we're going to compare the automatically generated stories to those handcrafted by experts at Archivit, and if the Mechanical Turk workers can't tell the difference between the automatically generated version and the human-generated version, then we'll consider them just as good. Because otherwise, if you're picking 28 out of millions of pages, there's no way we can pick the same 28, but we could have equally good summarizations. All right, so we gave some criteria to the people at Archivit. You can read that later. And they created stories, 23 stories for 10 different collections. Now, a lot of these are basically all of these are news-oriented collections. This is an important distinction. I mean, it's obviously important for this venue, but it's not clear that this technique will work for the state government websites and some of the other aspects that show up in Archivit. But you guys don't care about that, so we're good, right? And then we have different kinds of stories. This is sliding page, sliding time, fixed page, sliding time. Now, for some collections, we only got certain kinds of stories, so it's not a full 30 stories. But in some essence, intuitively, this is the most interesting kind of story that we want to examine. So here is a page generated for Boston Marathon bombing by the experts. And this looks good, and we have the good fav icons and the good titles and so forth. And then we had a process. I'll skip over the details, but there's lots of clustering and throwing out duplicates and off-topic and so forth. This is the automatically generated page. This is clearly different, but intuitively, it kind of looks the same. You can't really tell who generated which. We generated random stories, and basically we just picked 28 things randomly from the collection. And it's not bad, you get some stuff, but you know, you get Welcome to City of Boston and so forth. So you actually get some bad stuff that's thrown in there as well. Then as a control, we generated some bad stories, which is basically the same memento picked 28 times over and over again. And if a Turker said, I like this story, we said, okay, we don't like your data. So then we ran a comparison where we had 3 different kinds of hits where we compared human versus automatic, human versus the poor pages, and so forth. We only used master qualified stories, and we threw out if you picked the poor stories or if you used required less than 7 seconds. It's just clearly not enough time. The median time was actually 7 minutes. They spent a lot of time. And 50 cents for a hit is actually a pretty generous hit amount. So this is what a hit would look like. They would have a left and a right. It didn't talk about a human versus automatic. We said, we generated stories. Which one do you like best? And these were scrollable, independently scrollable. They would pick it. The punchline is preference for automatic and human stories basically indistinguishable. They couldn't tell the difference between human and automatic story. But they could tell the difference between a human and a random story and an automatically generated and a random story. So random is not equally good, but the experts versus automatic are equally good. Now for different kinds of stories, sliding page, sliding time, etc., basically they came out the same, and this also holds versus the random and the automatic versus random. So we basically didn't see a distinction between different kinds of stories. They were all easily identifiable. All right, so the punchline here is the automatically generated stories are just as good as the human stories. Now what we didn't prove is that these stories are useful for anything at all. It could be that they're equally bad, and I get that, but at least they're indistinguishable, so that's a start. All right. And the summarization here is return to the original slide, is we're taking the Storyfy interface people already know how to use, sampling from the Archivit collections, and using this to create a summary of what's in the collection. And I reference a bunch of data sets and code and papers and slides, and basically everything's available right here. And I think that's it. Thank you.